Alright guys, if you've been following this build at all, we're about to the point where we're wrapped up. Still got a little bit of stuff, but we're to the point where we're going to try to get the engine started. So this is the first time. We haven't cranked it over yet, but we've got all the fluids in, everything's back together. So we're going to give it a try. Here goes. Woo, baby! Oh yeah, that's awesome. That's a happy day, guys. Happy day. We better go get everybody out here. So this video, guys, is about the big question: will a Duramax actually fit in a GMT900, 1500, or half-ton platform? And the answer is yes, with some modifications. Most of the information you see out there when doing the conversion on a Yukon or Yukon XL, you have to do a 2-inch body lift. So we took a bunch of measurements ahead of time to see if we thought stuff would fit without the body lift. And so we actually put the engine in and the transmission together with the transfer case attached. We put that all in at once with no body lift. And the consensus is, yes, you do need a body lift. So we did get it in. It was very tight. And once we got the transmission in the correct position with the transmission mount, it was basically touching right up on the floor of the Yukon. The other problem is, I don't know if you can see it from this angle, but the intake, both the air intakes, so the cold air intake and the cold side intake after the intercooler, where the grid heater is, both stick up a fair amount above where the hood line would be. So yes, you do need a lift kit for everything to fit in. Now there may be some stuff, if you want to get crazy with it, you can probably do some other things to make it fit, but you would be, changing, components like the power steering, rack and pinion setup. You might be carving out part of the oil pan, the cast aluminum part of the oil pan of the Duramax. So engine mount things, you may be able to cut them off and weld them down lower. So if you're really interested in doing it without the body lift, it's fine. But we also noticed, because of the weight, that it does sit lower in the front, and so the body lift actually brings it more level. So it doesn't actually look like it has a body lift. And we did a raked body lift. So we have it installed now. We've got it up on the lift, and I'll show you here in a second. But we did a 2-inch lift at the very front corner, which is right here. And then we did 0 in the back. And so you'll see that. If you've done any research, you've seen people do the raked body lift. And I did get some really cheap spacers off of eBay, but you basically can choose diameter, bolt hole, height, stuff like that. And I bought lift blocks they were 3 inches in diameter, which is like the stock size. They had a 1/2 inch hole drilled in them, and they were 3 inches tall. And I basically cut them with a chop saw. And I think 1/2 inch, the guy that makes them, they're made for smaller vehicles, but I think that the 1/2 inch hole was the biggest option. And so that works on the front because the front bolts are a smaller diameter, but as you go back, the bolts are bigger, and I actually drilled them out. I think 5/8 is the right size. I don't have a 5/8 bit, so I use 3/4. And then as far as bolts go, you will have to get longer bolts for the very front and the second back body mount. But the last two, obviously the back one is not considered here. So anyway, the front bolt is a smaller diameter, and the 1/2 inch hole works fine. The rest of the bolts, you'll have to drill them out to 5/8 diameter, and the body blocks are usually like, some kind of a plastic, like polyethylene or something like that. You just want to be careful if you have to drill the hole out. You don't want to get the hollow blocks. The ones that we used were solid, so anything else that I can think of here? The installation is fairly easy. I just put a board running the length of the side of the body, and more toward the front I lifted it with a jack, and I had a jack on either side. And so the one problem area that you're going to run into is the mount that's behind the driver's side front tire on the 2007 body. And I'm not sure how this applies to other body styles, of course, because we're only doing it on this vehicle, but that body mount has a cup over the top of the mount, and so to fit a spacer in above the rubber mount bushing, or the insulator, I guess, you actually have to lift the body up like probably twice as high as you would just normally you would only have to lift it up the height of the block, but on this one you have to get that cup to go up higher. And so when you do that, my plan was going to be just to leave the back body mounts attached and then lift both sides at the same time and then put the spacers in. Well, that didn't work because of that cup. So what I did is I loosened the bolts on one side, but I kept them in. And then I took all of the bolts out on the driver's side. That way the whole body could rotate up. Because you don't want to get the position of the body messed up. You want to make sure it stays centered over your blocks. So you don't want to be lifting with no bolts in. So left all the bolts in on the passenger side, took all the bolts out on the driver's side, lifted the whole driver's side enough to get the clearance of that one block that has the cup over it. And then we put all those spacers in, let it go back down, right? So your bolts on the other side need to be loose enough so that, because when you set it back down, now you've set it back down on a raked angle. So you want to be sure that your bolts on the passenger side are loose enough to accommodate for, the front being higher now. So once you get those in, you can go to the other side. And the other side, the passenger side is fine. There's no cups over the top of the body mounts, so you can just lift it enough to get the spacers in there just fine. So I'll take you around and show you, but for clearance, both of the transmission, the tunnel for your drivetrain, and to be able to fit the stock Duramax stuff under the hood, you do need a body lift. And I looked around a little bit for custom intake stuff that's lower profile, and pretty much the reason that it's up tall like that is because the EGR cooler goes underneath there, and we've taken ours out, except we wanted to keep the stock cold side intake, so it's the intake that's after the intercooler, because since we live in a cold climate, we're keeping the grid heater, the air intake heater, and I can't find any aftermarket stuff that kept that. I mean, maybe there is. I didn't look a whole lot, and we're trying to be, you know, more cost effective too. So anyway, we left the EGR motor or the valve in so we could keep that stock intake and keep the angle spacing and everything. So we put blocker plates in between where the EGR valve and the intakes sit, and they're just really thin plates with gaskets. So anyway, there may be some custom stuff out there, but the custom turbo intake that I saw, like aftermarket stuff, you're talking like $350 just for that one piece. And let me see, I'll take you over there. All right, so bear with me a little bit here. So this is the intake that goes to the turbo. So this comes off of the air filter box, and you can see underneath there's a huge open area, and that's where the EGR cooler is normally. This is the EGR valve right here, and so we left that because this is the cold side intake off of the turbo. Off of the intercooler. This actually has the grid heater in it right here, and that mounts on top of the EGR valve housing. So we kept the EGR valve but have blocker plates in there. But those are the two things that stick up. And so I'll try to give you a good picture here. So you can see they still almost stick up a little, but the hood has a scoop in it. It goes up in the middle, so it fits without touching the insulator. And you can see our marks there where we had it before we put the lift kit in, so it was definitely hitting. The other consideration that you want to keep in mind is this clearance right here. So you'll have a lot of trouble if you don't do the body lift. You'll have a lot of trouble fitting your intake in. So we have the intake just fits in here. There's about 1/4 of an inch clearance right here. But not only did we have to do the 2-inch body lift which raises the airbox, we also had to do an airbox lift. And this is an S&B, and it's nice and sturdy how we have it. But we basically attached it into the body on the passenger side over here, and then we use these rubber spacers. It comes with some rubber spacers, but some of these are suspension bushings, and then this is the rubber spacer that comes with the airbox. But to get that to fit in and clear this intake, we had to lift that as well. And so that also clears the hood. But you can kind of see the angle, how the hood goes up in the middle. And then here's our body lift blocks. So here's the front lift block. So it just sits on top of the stock rubber bushing, so you still have your vibration reduction. And the bad thing about the Denali is you can't get a body lift kit for it, and so the only reason that matters is because the front bumper is actually attached to the frame. And so what happens if you just do a body lift on this and you don't do anything with the front bumper, you have a 2-inch gap right here under your headlights, which comes up, and then it goes under your hood and around, which looks horrible and nobody wants that. So like we mentioned in the last video, you gotta have some fabrication skills, and it's actually not too hard to fix the front bumper issue. And I'll show you what we did when we climb under there. And also just feel free to ask if there's stuff that you wanted to see that we didn't show. So obviously we're done. This is January of 2023. We finished this for the most part in May of 2022. So we've had some time to work through some things. There haven't really been very many issues, but we'll talk about those things as we get to them. So yeah, the Duramax will fit in the 1500 platform, provided you do a body lift or a raked body lift. to get the body up above. But the engine bay and the engine compartment is pretty much dimensionally the same as the LMM or the LBZ. Same with the transmission well in the body and everything. So what were some modifications that we had to do? So I talked about the body lift. So there's several body lift points. There's two on the front here. So on each side, so I'll say two, but so basically there's one here in the front. There's a lift point here. And then there's one in this neighborhood. There's one about here. And then there's two that are kind of over the axle. And they're more in the middle. And then there's the two in the back. And so obviously you don't have to do anything with the very back ones, barely anything in the front. And so what I did basically is we took a laser tape measure, and I had my boys basically hold a flat board here, and we measured at each point where there was a body mount from the front. So we measured from the front mount all the way down, and then that way we knew what our distance was and where each lift point was, and then we could figure out how tall that body mount needed to be. And we just bought body mount blocks off of eBay. They're like a polyurethane block, and then I just used the chop saw to cut them to the right height. If you can't find what you want on eBay, let me know, and I can send you a link of what we got. And you do need longer bolts for a couple of the mounts. So I believe it's just the front two that you need longer bolts for, and then everything from the middle back you can use the same bolts for. Once we were all prepped and we had all the blocks cut and drilled out and everything, it went really fast and it was a pretty easy thing. Make sure you put Loctite on the bolts when you put them back in. Looking at my list here again, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of those mounts. I'll show you this front one, and then I'll climb under the front bumper and I'll show you the fabrication that we did to get the front bumper lined up. Okay guys, so this is that front body mount, and you can see, let me just adjust this so I can get the light up there. So you can see that upper cup up there, and you can see the new puck up under there, but that's the cup that you have to clear to get the new body mount up in there. So that is the one that's just right in front of the front passenger, or sorry, the driver door and passenger door. And then another modification that you have to make, so this is the emergency brake cable right here, and it's too short to remain in the same position. So it used to come through this hole, and we had to drill a new hole and route it through here. That's because of the 2-inch body lift in the front. So that's really the only other modification that we had to make for the body lift. And so let's take a look at the front bumper. Okay guys, so we're looking at the front of the frame. So these two bolts here are the two bolts that hold your tow hooks in the front. And then the bumper actually has a bolt that goes through the top. It goes all the way through the top and into the bottom of that bracket to hold the bumper on. And so we cut the frame right here, so just behind these bolts, and then we slid it up 2 inches, and then we put a piece of angle iron on the bottom here, and then if you can see it, so same thing on the top going the opposite direction up here. So we basically slid the whole bumper assembly up, which keeps your tow hooks in the right spot and everything. And then we repainted it with liquid rubber. So you'll notice down here we left this open, and so you got to be careful when you're doing welding and fabrication and stuff. If you were to close this and weld it shut, if you got water up in there, it would basically eventually it would rust out your frame. So you want to be able to, you want the water to be able to get out of there. So that is how we did the front for the lift kit on this and for the bumper. Okay, so a couple of other things, obviously, so we've got the transmission mount had to be modified for it to fit in here. We have the engine mounts, so I'll climb under there and show you the transmission mount, and then we'll talk about the engine mounts. Okay, so here's the transmission mount. So the fabrication that had to be done here, basically, so this is your mount tube. It's a square tube that goes all the way across to the other side of the frame. And there's these two through bolts that hold it together. And basically, you've got to cut it right here, just past the end of this bracket that's welded to the frame. And then we put in a piece of 1/4-inch plate and welded it all the way around on both sides. And you basically have to slide your tube back. And it's not the full length of the tube. And so, and depending on what vehicle you're converting, that might be different. So, but that's the fabrication that's required for the transmission mount to get it to fit in there. So not too bad, really. So the engine mounts. So here are the two different engine mounts, and we didn't know what we were going to have to do. So this is the engine mount for the Yukon. So this one's old. This was off the other 6.2 that we pulled out. And that usually goes in as one piece. So you'll notice the bottom of these both have a 3-bolt setup here. And so I was hopeful that that would just bolt right up. Well, this center bolt on the GMT900 half-ton platform is further back than on the Duramax. So that wasn't going to work. We couldn't use the Duramax lower mount. Obviously, this was the Duramax. So our Duramax was in a rollover, and I don't know if that's what ripped the motor mounts off or not, but they were destroyed. And then the other problem is obviously the bolt pattern on the engine is different also. So this one's just a 4-bolt straight up above and below, and then the Duramax has an offset on 1 bolt. The other problem is that the motor mounts on the Yukon are straight across from each other, but the Duramax on the passenger side is shifted forward 3.5 inches, so it doesn't line up with the straight across engine mounts on the frame of the Yukon. And so we made an adapter bracket. It was just a piece of 1/4-inch plate that we moved the bolt holes on. We shifted the motor mount back, but still were able to use the bolt holes that were up in the front on the Duramax. And so that's only on the passenger side that we had to do that. And also, along with that, we used the 6.2 LS motor mounts instead of the Duramax motor mounts, because those fit perfectly, and we didn't have to modify the mounts that were on the frame. So using the adapter plate, I believe the one side of the Duramax has the same bolt pattern. Is that correct? Can you grab that other Duramax mount? Yeah. So actually what we did here is we cut part of that Duramax mount off of the old mount, and then we welded it onto this portion of the Yukon mount. And that gave us the that gave us this offset bolt pattern that's on the Duramax engine. So you can see there's bolts right above each other, just like the Yukon mount, but this one's offset. And so we cut that piece off and welded it onto the Yukon motor mount to make it fit. So one side has an adapter that shifts the mount back, and the other side is a straight bolt up with that piece of the old mount welded onto the Yukon mount. So hopefully that's clear. So I want to show you one other thing on the motor mounts. On the passenger side motor mount, you actually have to cut off so on the bottom of the Yukon motor mount, there's this pin. And so to get these to go in, the hole that has this, where this pin goes, has to actually be cut off. And that's because if you don't cut that off, you won't be able to get your starter out once you drop your motor in there. So I'll climb under and I'll see if I can show you where that motor mount is cut. Okay, so you can see there's the mount plate that we fabricated on, this is the passenger side. There's a little notch out of that plate so that your block heater can fit in. And the Yukon motor mount bolts to that plate, which then bolts up to the engine. And then if you can see at the bottom here, I'm going to try to get my finger up in there so you can see. So this right here has been cut. So that mount used to continue out all the way to catch the bottom of this mount here with that pin. And that's where we cut it off. And you can see the back of the starter just back there. And we have had to take the starter out once. And it just fits. So that is a really important thing that needs to happen. Okay, so some of the other few things that had to get changed to be able to fit this all in here was the oil fill tube. So this tube used to stick up, I don't know, probably a couple more inches. And so what we did is we cut a piece out of the middle and then welded it back together. That way we could retain the cap part of the fill tube. So that was one thing that we had to do. Then we also had to fabricate mounts. So the Duramax radiator and intercooler will not fit in this body style. And I don't know what other people have done in the past, but it's basically, I think you need to gain like another 5.5 inches or something like that. So a 2-inch body lift doesn't get you there. On the trucks, the frame actually dives down under the radiator, and so it gives you that extra space. But on the half-ton platform, the frame comes straight out, and so the only way to get that space is to do a really tall body lift, and that wasn't going to happen. So I'll talk about this more when we talk about the radiator and stuff, but basically the Yukon radiator is a really thin radiator and it has really wide tanks. And so what we had was a custom radiator built that took up the whole space, the width of the tanks, and it has plenty of cooling capacity. Probably more than the original Duramax radiator. The intercooler is actually up here in front of the grill. So we have the radiator, the AC condenser, and then we have the intercooler. And we'll take this grill off and show you that when we get to the intercooler videos. But you can look through the grill here now. And we had to do a little bit of fabrication to mount that. Maybe you can see in there better there. So there was a little bit of mounting brackets and stuff we had to put in there, but the whole radiator assembly comes up with the body. So there wasn't any extra stuff that we had to do, and basically this all attaches to the radiator support. And And then in front of that, we ended up putting an aftermarket transmission cooler as well. And we'll talk about that all in detail at a later time. So those are the main things as far as getting it to fit. The airbox here, we had to also put a lift kit on the airbox. It bolts right into the Yukon airbox platform that's existing. But if you look right here, you have very little clearance between your intake and your cold air. What is this? Your air intake and your cold air intake. So, and you can see we have an S&B air filter here, and we got it a little bit too high, so the hood just barely rubs right there. That's something that, you know, if you get this a little bit lower, like there's a little bit more clearance here. We've got like an inch or maybe 3/4 of an inch of clearance that we could have dropped this down a little bit further and then everything cleared. But that's the main reason that had to come up as well. So it has like a little lift kit in and of itself. And then the coolant bottle's in its regular location. And one of the reasons why the Yukon's coolant bottle wouldn't work is because the overflow tube on the coolant bottle on the Yukon comes out the top and it hits right on the intake here. And so we had to get the one for the Duramax, which comes off the bottom. So little stuff like that. And again, if we would have had the right donor, the LMM one is what we ended up having to buy. The LBZ one doesn't fit, it's fatter, doesn't fit in there. Yeah, so anyway, also the fuse, the mega fuses back there on the firewall, same thing. The Yukon has a mega fuse block, but it just has one fuse in it. If we would have had an LMM donor, we would have had that fuse block as well. So that's kind of part of the battery cable equation. So that's our will it fit video. Yes, it will fit with some qualifications there and a few things that need to be fixed, but hopefully that's helpful when you're looking into doing this and knowing what you've got in front of you. So I hope you like the video. Be sure to hit that subscribe and like button if you would, and we'll see you next time.